Sarah Mitchell had never imagined that her life's purpose would be tied so tightly to a single building. Yet from the moment she received the keys to the modest brick church that stood on the corner of Pine and Willow, she felt as though her entire identity and future had been placed into her hands. The church was not just a structure of stone, wood, and glass. It was a legacy carefully built by her late uncle, an architect who had poured his heart into designing a place where people could find both shelter and inspiration. The arched windows allowed light to fall in golden streams across the pews. The oak beams creaked softly like an old voice whispering history, and the bell tower, though modest, had rung out for decades, marking weddings, funerals, baptisms, and ordinary Sundays that together told the story of a community's life. For Sarah, who had stepped reluctantly into the role of pastor after years of doubting her ability to lead, the building became more than an assignment. It became the embodiment of her calling, a fragile but real chance to guide people toward faith and kindness while honoring the memory of the man who raised her when her parents were gone. Every morning she walked the gravel path that led up to the carved wooden doors, the faint scent of lilac from the garden mixing with the smell of old hymnals inside, and she felt grounded, as though the weight of the world could never crush her. As long as this place stood, the congregation was small, mostly elderly men and women who had been part of the neighborhood for generations, widows who came for companionship, retired veterans who sought solace, and families who returned out of loyalty more than enthusiasm. But they looked at Sarah with a trust that humbled her. Their respect was not for her alone, but for the continuity of something they all felt could not be allowed to vanish, even as time, money, and indifference pressed down like an unstoppable tide. She knew that leading a church in a suburban neighborhood was not glamorous, nor was it financially secure, but it offered her a sense of rootedness she had long craved, a rhythm of life that balanced devotion, service, and the daily upkeep of a fragile institution always a step away from financial ruin. While she repaired leaks in the roof and organized food drives, she also counseled lonely parishioners and spent evenings writing sermons that blended scripture with practical wisdom, her words echoing in the sanctuary late at night when she practiced them aloud to empty pews. In those quiet hours, Sarah allowed herself to dream that this church could once again become a centerpiece of the neighborhood, not through grandeur, but through the simple, stubborn presence of a community that refused to let go of its heart. Yet, even in those moments of hope, she could not ignore the disapproving gaze of her neighbor, Karen Collins, whose manicured backyard faced the churchyard like a silent accusation. Karen was always watching, always muttering about noise, about traffic on Sundays, about parking spilling onto her side of the street. Sarah tried to brush it off as ordinary neighborly friction, but sometimes when she caught Karen's sharp eyes, fixed on the church with something colder than annoyance, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft that seeped through the old stone walls. It was a Tuesday morning when the first blow came, not through confrontation on the sidewalk or an argument over boundaries, but in the form of an official-looking envelope slipped neatly into the church's mailbox, stamped with the seal of the Municipal Safety Department and folded so crisply it seemed to carry the weight of inevitability. Sarah had been arranging hymnals when she noticed the envelope, and though her hands were steady as she tore it open, her heart tightened with the kind of instinctive dread that precedes bad news. The letter was a formal notice declaring that an inspection had been conducted following a citizen complaint about the structural safety of the church, and that, based on preliminary findings, the building might be deemed unfit for public gatherings. Until a full review was complete. At first, Sarah thought it must have been some mistake, because she had not seen inspectors and no one had warned her. Yet the notice included details about cracks in the foundation and outdated wiring, issues she had never seen and that no previous inspection had flagged. The language was cold, technical, and absolute, outlining penalties, closures, and the immediate suspension of gatherings if risks were confirmed. But beneath the sterile phrasing, Sarah felt the tremor of something personal, as though the words had been chosen not just to inform but to intimidate. When she asked neighbors if they had seen inspectors, a retired man who lived nearby said he recalled two people with clipboards walking around the churchyard a few weeks earlier, though they never entered the building. And when she asked the department directly, they confirmed the complaint had been filed anonymously, but the follow-up had been triggered specifically because the complainant claimed to be a neighbor affected by negligence. Sarah did not need to be told who that neighbor was. Karen had spoken for months about how the church was falling apart and looked dangerous, always phrasing her barbs as if she were worried about public safety but never concealing the disdain in her voice. Sarah sat at her desk with the notice in front of her, the late morning light slanting across the paper, and felt a mixture of shock and betrayal rising like bile. The church had stood for decades, enduring storms and winters, the work of her uncle, the architect who had ensured every beam was reinforced, every wall properly aligned. For a moment, she even wondered if perhaps she had overlooked something. If the cracks in the plaster she had painted over last year were more than cosmetic. If the wires that sometimes flickered when lights were turned on too quickly did pose a danger. But she dismissed the thought, not because she refused to face reality, but because she knew the building had been inspected properly many times and always passed. It was the deliberate framing of the notice, the timing, and above all the anonymity that pointed unmistakably to malice. What hurt more than the threat of closure was the knowledge that someone who lived just steps away, someone she greeted politely at the fence, had gone out of her way to dismantle not only Sarah's work, but the heart of an entire community. As the days passed, more papers arrived, each heavier in implication, requests for documentation, demands for permits, reminders of liability should any incident occur. One letter even mentioned that liability might extend personally to the pastor, which Sarah read twice, her fingers trembling as she understood they were hinting at financial ruin if she dared resist. The congregation quickly learned of the notice, and while some reacted with immediate anger toward Karen, others looked at Sarah with hesitant eyes, as though asking silently if it was true that the church was unsafe. Their doubt cut deeper than Karen's hostility, for Sarah had worked tirelessly to nurture trust, only to see it shaken by one piece of paper. She resolved to fight, not with anger but with persistence, requesting a new inspection, gathering maintenance records, contacting her uncle's former colleagues to testify to the quality of his work, yet each step seemed to meet resistance. Calls were not returned, requests were delayed, and the same phrase appeared over and over in correspondence. Pending further review. Sarah began to realize this was not simply a routine complaint, but part of a larger maneuver, one that sought not just to raise concerns, but to weaponize bureaucracy against her. Then, in an almost surreal twist, she overheard Karen speaking in her backyard, her voice carrying through the open window on a breezy afternoon, bragging to a visiting friend that the city is finally doing something about that crumbling church, and adding with a laugh that soon the property would be worth more if it were put to proper use. The casual cruelty of the remark confirmed Sarah's worst fear. Karen's complaint was never about safety, but about power and control, about reshaping the neighborhood to her liking, even if it meant erasing a piece of history and a sanctuary that had carried people through generations. That night, Sarah sat in the empty sanctuary long after the sun had set. The notice spread across the altar like a desecration, and felt the fragile threads of her resolve tighten. If Karen wanted to use fear and official seals to push her out, then Sarah would meet her in that same arena, not as a victim, but as a steward of something larger than herself. She did not yet know how deep the deception ran, or what it would cost her to fight it. But she understood with clarity that the catalyst had been struck. The church was under siege, and with it her very sense of home, identity, and purpose. Sarah's decision to confront the growing storm came almost instinctively, born from the combination of dread and determination that had followed her since the first letter, and while she had always preferred quiet perseverance over open conflict, she knew the time for silence had ended. She began by walking into the municipal building, a low, concrete structure with the kind of bureaucratic sterility that seemed to leach color from everything, and requested access to the inspection records tied to her church. The receptionist, a young woman with a practiced polite smile that never touched her eyes, told Sarah she would need to file a formal request and wait several weeks, but Sarah pressed, citing her rights as the property's custodian, until finally a supervisor appeared, an older man with thinning hair who looked irritated by the mere inconvenience of her presence. He handed her a thin file, not the comprehensive record she expected, but a scant folder containing a few photocopied forms and a summary report that repeated, almost verbatim, the vague accusations of structural risk. What unsettled her more than the lack of detail was the fact that the inspector's signature at the bottom of the report was unfamiliar, belonging to someone who, after a quick search later that evening, she discovered was not a licensed municipal inspector at all, but a private consultant occasionally contracted by the city for overflow work. The realization hit her like a stone. The inspection had not been official, and yet the notice carried the full weight of authority, a manipulation so blatant she could barely process it. When Sarah returned home that night, exhausted and angry, she found Karen standing near the edge of her backyard, pruning roses with deliberate, almost theatrical slowness, as if she had been waiting for Sarah to appear. Their eyes met briefly, and Sarah felt an unspoken message in the smug tilt of Karen's smile, a silent confirmation that she knew exactly what had been discovered. It was then that Sarah grasped the depth of the game being played against her, one where appearances and influence mattered more than truth, where documents could be altered and signatures borrowed to create realities that would take months to untangle. She tried to share her findings with members of the congregation, presenting them with copies of the dubious report, but while a few believed her immediately, others looked uncertain, murmuring about whether fighting City Hall would only make things worse. Their hesitations stung, yet Sarah could not fault them, for she knew how fragile faith in institutions had become and how easily people sought stability over confrontation. Determined not to falter, Sarah turned to her uncle's old contacts, reaching out to a retired building inspector who had once collaborated with him during the original construction. The man, a widower now living in a small apartment on the outskirts of town, welcomed her hesitantly, but warmed as soon as she mentioned her uncle's name, recalling him as a man of integrity who insisted on precision. When Sarah showed him the supposed inspection summary, he laughed bitterly, pointing out inconsistencies, materials listed that had never been used, dimensions misstated, and even a reference to a non-existent fire exit. He told her, almost conspiratorially, that such sloppy falsifications were not accidents, but deliberate acts designed to discredit, and he urged her to hold on to every piece of evidence because someone had clearly invested effort into rewriting history. His words lent her a fragile hope, but also sharpened her fear, for if falsified documents could pass unchallenged into official channels, then Karen's influence or connections were deeper than simple neighborly malice. The situation escalated further when Sarah received a second notice, this one from the Homeowners Association, which had long since stopped involving itself with church matters, but now suddenly declared that her property was in violation of neighborhood standards due to unapproved modifications. The alleged modifications included the very bell tower that had stood since the church's founding, as though it had been magically constructed overnight without authorization. Sarah read the letter 3 times, her frustration mounting, and realized that the strategy had shifted from isolated complaints to a coordinated pressure campaign, a web of accusations designed to bury her in procedural quicksand. Each notice carried threats of fines, hearings, and liens, all of which would take money and time to contest, and she could almost hear Karen's voice behind them, sweetly insistent that she was simply ensuring fairness, while in reality she was tightening a noose. On a gray afternoon, not long after, Sarah walked into the church to find 2 parishioners waiting nervously by the door, papers in hand. They explained with visible discomfort that Karen had visited them personally, showing them a glossy pamphlet she had produced claiming the church was unsafe for occupancy and encouraging them to sign a petition for the good of the neighborhood. Sarah's heart sank as she read the pamphlet, which contained staged photographs of cracks exaggerated with marker, claims that children had tripped on uneven steps, and even a fabricated anecdote about falling plaster nearly injuring someone during a service. The signatures on the petition were few but included names Sarah recognized, people who had sat in her pews, people she had counseled in grief. The betrayal left her speechless, and for the first time she felt a flash of despair that perhaps Karen's tactics would succeed. Not because they were true, but because lies repeated loudly enough often became indistinguishable from fact. That evening, Sarah locked herself in her office, surrounded by folders, photographs, and the fading scent of candle wax from the day's prayers, and she let the weight of everything settle over her. The letters, the falsified reports, the pamphlets, the whispered doubts of her parishioners. Each piece was a thread in a net designed to suffocate her and the church. Yet beneath her exhaustion burned a defiance she had not known she possessed. The certainty that surrender would mean more than losing a building. It would mean betraying the memory of her uncle and the trust of those who still believed in her. The escalation was undeniable now. Karen had moved from whispers and casual complaints to a full campaign of disinformation and intimidation. And Sarah understood with a kind of grim clarity that the battle ahead would not be fought only in courtrooms or offices, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who had once looked to the church as a refuge. The pressure reached a breaking point when Sarah, after weeks of unanswered calls and sleepless nights spent combing through old files, finally stumbled upon a discovery that shifted the entire perspective of the conflict, turning suspicion into confirmation and giving her the first real weapon to fight back. It happened almost by accident when she visited the county records office again, this time determined to cross-reference the property surveys that had been quietly invoked against her in the latest HOA complaint. She had grown used to the disinterested clerks who seemed more intent on pushing papers than answering questions, but on this particular afternoon she encountered a middle-aged man with tired but kind eyes, who, after hearing her request, paused for a moment as if debating whether to speak further. Instead of handing her the usual stack of redacted photocopies, he led her down a dim hallway to a row of filing cabinets, where he retrieved a bound ledger covered in dust. "No one bothers with the old maps anymore," he murmured, "but if you want the truth about boundaries, you need to start where they began, not where someone wants them to be today." Inside the ledger, Sarah found a series of plats dating back to the early 20th century, drawn meticulously in ink by surveyors who measured land with chains and compasses rather than digital instruments. As she traced the outlines of her church property, she noticed something astonishing. The original lot was significantly larger than the current one reflected in recent documents, extending several yards beyond the existing fence line and encompassing a strip of land that now formed part of Karen's manicured backyard, the very strip on which her glittering blue swimming pool had been installed 5 years earlier. Sarah's pulse quickened as she turned page after page, confirming with each map that the reduction of the church lot had occurred only in the last 3 decades, coinciding with the tenure of a zoning commissioner who, she remembered from whispers in, the neighborhood had been a close friend of Karen's late husband. The implications were staggering. Not only had Karen filed false complaints to undermine the church, but her own property stood, quite literally, on land that had been taken from the church itself through what now appeared to be fraudulent boundary adjustments. Sarah carried copies of the maps back to the church, her hands trembling not with fear, this time, but with the exhilaration of finally holding tangible proof that the narrative had been twisted. That evening she called her small group of allies, parishioners who had remained steadfast, the retired inspector who had already flagged inconsistencies, and a young attorney named Daniel Hayes who had once been part of the congregation before, leaving for law school. Daniel listened carefully as Sarah laid the maps on the worn wooden table in the parish hall, his brow furrowing as he compared them with modern surveys. "This isn't a clerical error," he said at last, his voice low with controlled anger. "This is deliberate. Someone redrew boundaries and filed them as if they were legitimate, and no one ever challenged it because the church didn't have the money or the vigilance to notice. Karen's pool isn't just on disputed ground, it's on stolen land." The words hung in the air, heavy with the gravity of revelation, and Sarah felt both vindicated and horrified. Vindicated, because the truth was now visible, and horrified, because exposing it would not simply restore justice, but would ignite a war that Karen, with her arrogance and resources, would fight to the bitter end. In the days that followed, Sarah and Daniel began to assemble a dossier, combining the old maps with testimonies, maintenance records, and the inspector's expert notes, creating a narrative that revealed the manipulation of property lines and the falsification of safety reports. But even as they built their case, Karen struck back with renewed ferocity. Pamphlets appeared in mailboxes claiming that Sarah was endangering children by refusing to close a crumbling structure, and anonymous notes were slipped under the church doors late at night warning her to walk away before it's too late. The tone of the notes was chilling, not the bureaucratic detachment of official letters, but something more personal, dripping with contempt, as though whoever wrote them took pleasure in the idea of frightening her into silence. Sarah's hands shook when she read them, but instead of retreating, she pinned them on the wall of her office as a reminder of what she was up against. The true midpoint came not in the discovery itself, but in the confrontation it provoked. At a hastily arranged mediation session called by the HOA to address the growing dispute, Sarah arrived with Daniel and her stack of evidence, determined to at least put the truth on record. Karen was already there, dressed immaculately, her posture rigid with the confidence of someone convinced of her untouchable status. She spoke first, her voice smooth and performative, painting Sarah as an irresponsible caretaker who clung to an outdated building at the expense of community safety, and when she referenced the overdue demolition of the church, a murmur of agreement rippled among some of the board members. Sarah's throat tightened, but she steadied herself, waited for Karen to finish, and then slowly spread the old maps across the table. The room fell silent as Daniel explained the discrepancies, pointing out how the church's property had been unlawfully reduced and how Karen's backyard fell squarely within the original boundaries. For a moment, Karen's mask cracked, her eyes darting to the maps with a flash of recognition before she quickly recovered, dismissing them as irrelevant relics that had no bearing on modern zoning. Yet the seed had been planted. The board members leaned in to examine the maps, and one even asked aloud why the boundaries had changed so drastically in recent decades. The tension in that room marked a turning point, for Sarah saw that Karen was not invincible, that beneath the polished exterior she was vulnerable to exposure, and that her power rested not on truth, but on the fragile scaffolding of intimidation and forged paperwork. Still, Sarah also understood that the battle was far from over, because Karen's eyes as they met hers across the table held something darker than irritation, something closer to a vow. The war had now moved into the open, and for the first time Sarah felt both the exhilaration of momentum and the chilling awareness that Karen would not simply retreat when cornered. As Sarah walked out of the mediation room into the heavy evening air, she clutched the folder of maps tightly, knowing that she carried not just evidence but the hinge on which the entire conflict would now turn. The church's survival was no longer a question of passive endurance but of active defense, and Karen, stripped of her veil of benevolence, had revealed herself as an adversary willing to fight with every weapon at her disposal. The midpoint had arrived, and from here the stakes could only rise. The weeks that followed the mediation session were unlike anything Sarah had endured before, because what had once been a private battle between her and Karen now spilled fully into the public arena, infecting the neighborhood with suspicion, whispered accusations and sudden divisions that fractured relationships which had seemed unshakable. Sarah had hoped that the revelation of the old maps would force Karen into retreat, or at least quiet her campaign of pressure. But instead, it provoked a counteroffensive so aggressive that Sarah realized Karen's strategy was not merely to win, but to exhaust, to suffocate her beneath an avalanche of legal maneuvers, social pressure, and raw intimidation. The first blow came in the form of a formal lawsuit filed by Karen's attorney, alleging that Sarah was engaged in malicious interference with property enjoyment, a vague but inflammatory claim that sought damages not only for emotional distress but also for the devaluation of Karen Collins' residence. The language was filled with exaggerated grievances, noise from church bells that supposedly disrupted Karen's health, crowds that allegedly endangered traffic flow, and the presence of an unstable building that cast what the lawsuit called a psychological shadow over her property. Sarah read the pages with disbelief, but Daniel warned her that even frivolous suits could entangle her for months, draining time and money while undermining her credibility. At the same time, the HOA escalated its involvement, announcing that it would conduct a special hearing to determine whether the church remained compliant with neighborhood standards, despite the fact that religious properties had always been treated as independent. The announcement was accompanied by a notice of potential fines for unauthorized structural elements, and once again the bell tower was listed as though it had appeared overnight without approval. Sarah felt as if she were trapped in a hall of mirrors, where every familiar aspect of her church was suddenly redefined as an infraction. She tried to rally support from her congregation, but attendance at services began to dwindle as parishioners quietly admitted they feared being drawn into a legal battle or suffering retaliation from Karen and her allies. The pamphlets Karen distributed had grown bolder, now featuring color photographs of the church juxtaposed with stock images of collapsing buildings, along with captions warning that disaster is only a matter of time. Some neighbors, even those who had no particular loyalty to Karen, began to wonder aloud if it was worth the risk to keep attending services, and Sarah felt the ache of betrayal every time a once familiar face was absent from the pews. Karen, emboldened by the lawsuit, turned to more insidious tactics as well. One afternoon, Sarah discovered that the rear fence of the church property had been cut clean through, leaving a gap that opened directly into Karen's backyard, where the pool glistened mockingly in the sun. When Sarah confronted her, Karen simply shrugged and suggested that perhaps the fence had decayed naturally, though the fresh saw marks told another story. Later that week, Sarah returned from errands to find a bright orange notice taped to the church doors, claiming the building had failed a supplemental inspection and was unsafe for assembly, though when Daniel checked, no such inspection had been scheduled by the city. Someone had gone to the trouble of forging official stationery and placing the notice in plain view, an act Sarah recognized immediately as psychological warfare intended to frighten her congregation further. Daniel insisted they keep the notice as evidence, but the damage had been done. Several elderly parishioners called Sarah in tears, asking if they were in danger by attending services, and she found herself spending hours reassuring them that the church was still open, even as her own confidence wavered. Meanwhile, Karen attempted to co-opt the narrative by hosting a neighborhood gathering in her backyard, framing it as a safety awareness meeting. Sarah was not invited, but she later heard from sympathetic neighbors that Karen had stood before her. Poole, gesturing dramatically toward the church across the fence, and claimed that Sarah was ignoring urgent hazards while trying to steal land that rightfully belonged to her. She even unveiled what she called proof, a set of documents she claimed were signed permits from the 90s, authorizing her late husband's acquisition of the disputed strip. When Daniel examined the description of those documents later, he immediately recognized inconsistencies in dates and formatting, strongly suggesting forgery, but the damage was again reputational. Karen's audience walked away muttering about legal, complexities, their doubts growing heavier by the day. The escalation was not only legal and social but emotional, striking at Sarah's resilience. Nights grew longer as she sat in her office surrounded by evidence. Her uncle's blueprints on one side of the desk and Karen's forged complaints on the other, each piece a reminder of how truth and lies now collided in ways that blurred certainty. She felt the isolation acutely, the absence of those who had once pledged loyalty but now avoided her calls, and she wondered how long she could endure before fatigue cracked her composure. Yet, even in her darkest moments, she found sparks of resolve. In the retired inspector who called her weekly to remind her she was not alone, in the widowed parishioner who pressed a small envelope of savings into her hand with trembling fingers, whispering that the church had saved her life after her husband's death, in Daniel's calm assurance that the law, however slow, still bent toward truth if one was patient enough to hold it steady. By the end of that month, Sarah realized she stood at the threshold of a storm larger than she had ever imagined. The conflict had evolved from a simple nuisance into a coordinated assault, one that combined lawsuits, forged notices, neighborhood propaganda, and psychological pressure in a campaign designed to break her spirit and erase the church from the community's memory. But it was also the point at which she understood, with absolute clarity, that retreat would not protect her or anyone else, because Karen's greed and arrogance would not stop at the church walls. The escalation had sharpened the lines of battle, leaving Sarah bruised but unbroken, and as she looked at the faded maps spread across her desk late into the night, she whispered a vow into the silence. She would not allow lies to prevail, no matter how deep Karen's influence reached or how heavy the burden became. The fight was no longer about preserving a building alone. It was about resisting the corruption that sought to rewrite history itself, and Sarah knew she could not and would not walk away. The courtroom felt colder than Sarah had expected, not because of the air conditioning but because of the tension that settled over every wooden bench and marble column, a weight that pressed down on her shoulders as if the building itself were holding its breath. Weeks of preparation had led to this day, a hearing that would determine whether the church could remain open or whether Karen's campaign of complaints and lawsuits would finally succeed in crushing it. Sarah sat beside Daniel, her young attorney whose calm demeanor masked a relentless precision, and clutched the folder of maps and records that had become her shield. Across the room, Karen entered with calculated poise, dressed in a pale suit that projected elegance, her chin raised as if the outcome were already decided. Behind her trailed her attorney, a man with an oily smile who carried a stack of papers so thick it seemed designed to intimidate by sheer volume. The proceedings began with Karen's side presenting its case, a litany of grievances that by now Sarah could recite from memory. Claims that the church was unsafe, that services disrupted the neighborhood, that Sarah was attempting to seize land under false pretenses. Each point was delivered with theatrical flourish, supported by photographs carefully staged to exaggerate flaws. A crack in plaster, photographed up close to look like a gaping fissure, a tilted angle making a step appear dangerously uneven. Then came the forged documents, the so-called permits from the 90s that Karen insisted proved her husband had lawfully expanded their property. Sarah listened, her pulse steady but her stomach knotted, as Karen even allowed her voice to tremble slightly, painting herself as a widow struggling only to protect her home and her memories, a performance so polished that a few spectators in the gallery nodded with sympathy. For a moment, Sarah feared the tide might be turning, that emotion might outweigh fact, but Daniel leaned closer and whispered that patience was their ally, and she held her breath as the judge finally turned to hear their response. Daniel began quietly, his voice even and deliberate, walking through the inconsistencies in Karen's claims one by one. He produced the testimony of the retired inspector who had confirmed that the church was structurally sound, highlighting that the supposed inspection report Karen had relied on bore the signature of someone who was not even licensed. He then laid out the series of old plats, maps inked by surveyors decades earlier, which demonstrated beyond question that the land beneath Karen's pool had belonged to the church until boundary lines were mysteriously redrawn. At first, Karen's attorney dismissed the maps as outdated, but Daniel calmly pointed out that property law recognizes original plats as authoritative unless formally superseded, and no record of such a legal supersession existed. When pressed by the judge, Karen's attorney fumbled, unable to explain the absence of any legitimate filing. Then Daniel delivered the decisive strike, holding up a letter written years ago by Sarah's uncle, the architect, in which he had warned the zoning board of irregularities and explicitly objected to the reduction of the church's lot. The letter, preserved in the county archive but forgotten until Sarah had uncovered it, carried both his signature and the official seal of receipt, leaving no doubt that the church's protest had once been ignored. The courtroom shifted palpably as the judge examined the evidence, his expression hardening. Karen, who until then had sat with icy composure, leaned forward, her face tightening, and when the judge asked directly whether she had been aware that her pool stood on disputed land, she faltered for the first time. She stammered about her late husband handling the details, about trusting his word, but her polished veneer cracked just enough to reveal the desperation beneath. The judge's ruling came not with drama, but with measured authority. The complaints against the church were dismissed as unsubstantiated, the property boundaries would be restored to their original lines, and Karen was ordered to cease use of the disputed land immediately, with the possibility of the pool's removal pending further review. Furthermore, the submission of falsified inspection documents was referred to the district attorney for investigation, a statement that sent a visible ripple of shock through the gallery. Sarah felt her chest loosen for the first time in months, though victory carried not elation but an exhausted kind of relief, as if she had been holding her breath underwater and only now broke the surface. She glanced at Karen, who sat rigid, her eyes burning with fury rather than defeat, and knew the woman would not forgive or forget, yet the weight of the law had shifted decisively. The church was safe, its legitimacy reaffirmed, and the tide that had threatened to drown Sarah had turned back upon the one who had unleashed it. In the weeks after the ruling, the neighborhood settled into a strange quiet, the kind of silence that follows a storm when the ground is still damp and the air carries the weight of what has passed, and for Sarah, that silence felt less like emptiness and more like space to breathe again. The church stood unchanged in its modest dignity, its bell ringing once more on Sunday mornings, yet there was a new sense of reverence among those who came through its doors, as though the building itself had been tested and proven worthy. Attendance slowly grew, not only from returning parishioners but from neighbors who had once stayed away out of fear, now moved by the resilience they had witnessed. They brought casseroles for the community suppers, volunteered to repaint peeling walls, and offered labor to mend the cracked steps that had once been exaggerated in Karen's photographs, their collective effort transforming maintenance into an act of solidarity. Sarah watched them with gratitude that bordered on awe, realizing that what had nearly been taken from her had instead bound the community more tightly together. Karen, meanwhile, became a ghostly presence, no longer striding proudly along the fence line but retreating into her home, blinds drawn, her pool covered and unused. Rumors circulated about fines, about the cost of potential demolition, about her refusal to attend HOA meetings where her influence had once been unchallenged. But Sarah paid little attention, for she no longer needed Karen's downfall to measure her own strength. The church's survival was not a triumph of vengeance, but of perseverance, proof that truth could withstand even the most elaborate web of lies if one had the courage to hold steady. Late at night, Sarah sometimes sat alone in the sanctuary, the lamplight casting long shadows across the pews, and thought of her uncle, imagining his quiet pride that the building he designed had endured not just storms of weather, but storms of human ambition. She knew new challenges would come, for nothing built of stone and faith was free from struggle, but she felt steadier now, tempered by the fire of the conflict, certain that she would never again doubt her place. The church was no longer just an inheritance or a duty. It was a victory, a living symbol of resilience, and as Sarah looked out at her congregation gathered in renewed harmony, she understood that the true resolution was not in Karen's silence or even in the judge's ruling, but in the simple, enduring fact that the bells still rang and people still came, choosing hope over fear.